My parents called me a failure, laughed when I became homeless. Years later, I became rich, and now they beg me for help. Growing up, my parents didn't see me as their kid. They saw me as a burden. I was the mistake, the one who was supposed to work harder, bring them pride, or at least make their lives easier. Instead, I was their favorite punching bag, emotionally, sometimes physically, but mostly with words sharp enough to carve scars. From as far back as I remember, the phrase failure was glued to my name. If I got a B instead of an A, I was a failure. If I didn't run as fast as a neighbor's kid, I was a failure. If I dared to dream about anything beyond the small, gray box they called life, I was the dumbest failure of all. Other kids brought home drawings to stick on the fridge. Me, my drawings went straight to the trash. My achievements were met with mocking laughs and eye rolls. I remember once bringing home a spelling bee certificate in 4th grade. My mom didn't even look at it before saying, "Certificates don't pay bills. Why don't you do something useful?" My dad smirked and added, "Don't bother. He'll never make it." By the time I hit high school, their constant chorus of, "You'll never be anything," had become my daily background noise. I stopped trying to impress them. What was the point? If I cleaned the house, they'd say I missed a spot. If I work a part-time job, they'd remind me it wasn't enough. And if I dared to talk about college, they'd laugh like I had just told the funniest joke in the world. I started noticing how differently they treated my younger siblings. My brother got praise for half the effort I put in. My sister was spoiled with clothes, gadgets, and affection I never saw. I was the odd one out, the one singled out, the problem child despite never actually causing problems. It's almost like they needed me to be the family scapegoat just to feel better about themselves. The cruelest part? Deep down, I still crave their approval. Every insult cut deeper because I wanted, just once, to hear them say they were proud. But those words never came. Instead, my father had a favorite line he'd toss at me whenever I looked too hopeful. "Kid, you're destined to be nothing. And one day, when you're on the streets, don't come crying to us." At the time, I thought it was just another insult. I didn't know he was basically predicting what they'd make happen. By the time I turned 18, the word failure wasn't just what they called me. It was what I almost believed I was. My parents had a way of twisting every small joy into a reminder that I was worthless. I'd come home from school with decent grades, and instead of hearing "good job," my dad would sneer. "College? For you? Don't waste your time. You'll end up flipping burgers." I did get a part-time job at a burger joint. I was proud of it. It was my first step toward independence. But when I brought my first paycheck home, my mom laughed so hard she nearly cried. "That's it? That's what you call money? You'll never survive out there." I thought maybe if I work harder, they'd respect me. I saved every dollar I could, skipped going out with friends, and tried to plan for the future. But they didn't see responsibility. They saw weakness. Anytime I mentioned saving, they called me greedy. Anytime I mentioned moving out, they told me I'd come crawling back in weeks. The tension grew unbearable. They'd start fights over nothing, dirty dishes, the way I breathed, the fact that I was home too much or not home enough. It didn't matter. If they wanted to tear me down, they'd find a reason. And I didn't fight back. I just absorbed it like a sponge soaking up poison. Then came the breaking point. One night, after a long double shift, I came home exhausted. My dad was waiting. He asked how much I made that day. I told him honestly. He snorted and said, "Pathetic. That's barely enough to feed yourself. You're a grown man and still a damn failure." I stayed quiet, but silence was gasoline on his fire. He exploded, yelling, cursing, spitting in my face. My mom jumped in too, accusing me of being lazy, of being dead weight, of wasting their food and electricity. Finally, my father pointed at the door and shouted, "If you think you're grown, go prove it. Get the hell out of my house." I thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. He grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with random clothes, and literally shoved me outside. My mom followed with one last laugh. "Don't forget, we told you. You'll end up on the street." And just like that, I was standing on the sidewalk, holding a half-zipped backpack, no money in my pocket, no place to go. Their laughter echoed in my ears as the door slammed shut. I remember staring at that house, my so-called home, and realizing I wasn't welcome anymore. That was the night I stopped being their child and became just another broken piece they tossed away. The first night on the street felt unreal. I kept waiting for the door to open for my mom to call me back inside. Maybe even pretend it was all a cruel lesson. But the door stayed shut. Their laughter faded, and I was left in the cold silence of reality. I wandered aimlessly with no plan. My friends' houses weren't an option. I was too ashamed to admit what had happened. I ended up at a bus stop, clutching my backpack like it was armor. That bench became my bed. The streetlights above buzzed and flickered, and I kept jerking awake at every sound, afraid someone would rob me or worse. Morning brought no relief. My body ached, my throat was dry, and I hadn't eaten since yesterday. I walked to work, trying to pretend everything was normal. I flipped burgers, smiled at customers, and hid the fact that I had nowhere to return to. After my shift, I stayed as long as I could in the bathroom, splashing water on my face, just to avoid going back outside. But eventually I had to. The streets became my reality. I learned which benches were safest, which alleys stayed quiet, and where the soup kitchens were. Nights were the hardest. My stomach growled so loudly I couldn't sleep, and the cold cut through every layer of clothing I had. Sometimes I'd press my forehead against the concrete wall of a building just to feel something solid, something real. And yet, even then, their voices haunted me. I'd hear my dad sneer in my head, "You'll never survive out there." Some nights, I almost believed him. But something strange happened too. For the first time in my life, I wasn't under their roof, their rules, their constant poison. Yes, I was starving, broke, and homeless, but I was free. And in that freedom, a tiny spark of defiance was born. I remember one night clearly. I sat under a bridge, shivering, my stomach twisted in knots, and I whispered to myself, "I won't die like this. I'll prove them wrong." It didn't matter that I had nothing, no bed, no family, no money. What mattered was that for the first time, the voice in my head wasn't theirs. It was mine. I clung to that spark. It didn't make the nights warmer or the hunger easier, but it gave me a reason to keep moving. I promised myself, if I ever climbed out of this pit, I'd do it on my own terms. And when I did, I made sure my parents would see every single step of my rise. They wanted me broken. They wanted me begging. Instead, they had just created the one thing they feared most, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Days blurred into weeks. I was still homeless, still hungry, still dragging myself from shift to shift at the fast food joint. But I had something that most people around me didn't, desperation that burned like fuel. Every dollar mattered. Every small win was survival. I stopped wasting money on anything unnecessary. If I got tips, they went straight into a hidden jar I kept in my backpack. I ate only the discounted leftovers from work. I drank water from public fountains. Slowly, painfully slowly, I scraped together a little stash. It wasn't much, but to me it was power. The first real break came in the form of a coworker, Maria. She noticed I never talked about home, never joined when the others complained about parents. One night after closing, she pulled me aside. "You don't have a place to stay, do you?" she asked softly. My throat went dry. I thought she was mocking me. But then she offered her couch. She lived in a cramped studio, barely enough for herself and her kid, but she didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, I slept on something softer than concrete. I cried into her pillow when no one could hear. Her kindness lit another spark. I realized that not everyone in the world wanted to see me fail. Some people could lift you up, even if they didn't have much themselves. And with her roof over my head, I had enough stability to do more than just survive. I picked up extra shifts. I begged for overtime. I watched how the managers operated, how they ordered supplies, how they cut corners. I wasn't just flipping burgers anymore. I was studying business, even if it smelled like grease. At night, I borrowed books from the library. Finance, self-improvement, entrepreneurship. I devoured everything. It felt like building muscles in my brain. Every page was a weapon, every idea a potential escape route. But make no mistake, life was still brutal. Maria eventually couldn't keep me, and I found myself back on the street more than once. Still, I had momentum. I wasn't just drifting anymore. I was moving with intent. The final shove came from my father himself. Months after I'd last seen him, He strolled into the restaurant one afternoon with his new family. I froze when I saw them at the counter. He smirked at me like I was still the same worthless kid. "See, told you you'd end up in a dead-end job." He chuckled loudly, making sure everyone around could hear. His wife laughed too. Even his new kids looked at me with pity. That moment burned into me. My fists clenched so hard I thought I'd break them. But instead of lashing out, I smiled. I took their order. I handed over their greasy bags of food. And inside, I made a vow. One day, I'll own something you'll never touch. One day, you'll choke on your words. That humiliation wasn't the end. It was the beginning. After months of barely surviving, I hit the lowest low. One night, I slept on a park bench after missing my shift because I had no way to get to work. Rain soaked me to the bone, and I felt every pang of hunger, every ache in my body, every humiliating memory of my parents laughing at me. The world had reduced me to a number in their failure ledger. And then something shifted. I was sitting there, shivering, staring at the small puddle reflecting streetlights, and I realized I had nothing left to lose. Every insult, every beating, every dismissal, they couldn't take anything more from me. My fear was gone, replaced by a stubborn ember that refused to die. If I stayed in this cycle, I'd die slowly, hungry, beaten, bitter. But if I took control, even a little, I could change the trajectory. I remembered the small victories from before, Maria's couch, the library books, the overtime shifts. I remembered how I felt when I learned something new or managed to save even a few dollars. That spark reminded me that knowledge and strategy were weapons, and I had no one to answer to but myself. I scavenged the city with a new purpose. I didn't just look for food, I looked for opportunity. I asked questions, watched the hustle of small businesses, noted who owned what, how the streets worked. I started cleaning offices at night, washing dishes, anything that gave me cash. But unlike before, I wasn't just surviving, I was thinking ahead. I opened a small notebook, scribbling down ideas for small ventures. Selling items online. Freelancing. Anything that required brains more than capital. My hands shook from the cold, but my mind raced. I made a plan, a tiny blueprint for escape. It wasn't glamorous. My first attempt was selling refurbished electronics I found cheap. People scoffed at me. I made mistakes, overpaid for items, lost money on shipping. But every failure taught me something new. The humbling, exhausting nights on concrete became classrooms. Each rejection was a lesson, each insult a data point. And slowly, the grind began to pay off. I made my first $100, then $200. I stashed every penny. I didn't buy clothes, didn't indulge in food, didn't celebrate. Every dollar went back into the plan. I became obsessed, not with revenge yet, but with survival and the sweet taste of independence. At that moment, I made another vow. I will never be helpless again. I will never beg anyone for a roof over my head. I will never hear them laugh at me and stay silent. That determination was stronger than any fear, stronger than the years of abuse, stronger than the nights on wet concrete. The spark had ignited a wildfire inside me, and that fire would not be quenched. The first real taste of independence was intoxicating. I started small, freelance graphic design for local businesses, taking any odd jobs that paid cash, selling refurbished electronics online. Every deal, every completed task felt like a victory against the past life that tried to break me. I wasn't rich yet, not by any stretch, but I was earning, surviving, and, most importantly, I was free from their control. I remember the first time I deposited money into my own bank account. I stared at the number like it was a beacon of hope. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one had earned it but me. No one could laugh at me for being homeless because I was slowly building a life on my terms. That night, for the first time in years, I slept in a bed I had paid for myself, in a small room I rented on a friend's recommendation. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and safe. With each small win, my confidence grew. I learned about investments, savings, budgeting, skills my parents had never taught me. I devoured books on entrepreneurship and finance, often reading late into the night after long shifts. Knowledge became my armor. I became meticulous with my money, recording every transaction, every expense, every potential opportunity. By the end of the first year, I had enough to rent a small studio apartment. I furnished it cheaply but thoughtfully, creating a space where I felt in control. I started building a network, reaching out to people who could teach me skills I lacked. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for something bigger. And then came the moment that truly made me realize the power of perseverance. A client who had been impressed by my work referred me to a larger company. That one connection led to a contract that doubled my monthly income. Suddenly, I wasn't just scraping by. I had financial breathing room. I could invest, save, and plan for the future. During this time, I occasionally thought about my parents. Their laughter, their insults, the way they told me I'd never amount to anything. At first, it stung like a fresh wound. But over time, their words became fuel. Every insult, every mocking comment became a reminder of why I needed to succeed. Not for them, but for myself. I also reconnected with my younger sister in secret. She had suffered under their hand too, but she was resilient. I gave her advice, small tips to survive, and encouraged her to focus on school and hobbies. Helping her became a moral compass, a reminder that while I was chasing wealth, I could also protect the people I cared about. By the end of year 2, my modest side hustles had grown into something more sustainable. I began outsourcing small tasks, turning small profits into bigger ones, reinvesting every penny. I learned that wealth isn't just about money. It's about control, stability, and freedom. And finally, after years of abuse, homelessness, and ridicule, I felt that freedom creeping closer. It was the first time I realized I could rewrite the story of my life, and this time I would write it on my own terms. By the third year, my side projects had evolved into a real business. I had clients across the country, some even international, and my income steadily increased. I started diversifying freelance design, small digital products, and eventually investing in stocks and crypto. Each calculated move was a step away from the helplessness of my teenage years. I also took the time to educate myself. Online courses, webinars, books, anything that would give me an edge. I learned about marketing, branding, negotiation, even the psychology of sales. My focus was relentless. The memory of my parents' laughter and my homelessness became a quiet, burning drive. I would never let anyone make me feel powerless again. The real breakthrough came when I identified a gap in the market for a specific digital service I could provide. I put together a small team, freelancers I trusted, and began offering this service nationwide. Profits soared faster than I had expected. Suddenly, I had more money than I had ever imagined. I was no longer scraping by. I was rich, not ostentatiously yet, but enough to secure my future and live comfortably without ever depending on anyone again. During this period, I also began rebuilding my personal life. I rented a proper apartment, furnished it comfortably, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at home. I paid off old debts, cleared bills, and stabilized my finances. Every move was deliberate. Every decision a reaffirmation. My past would not define me. Then, out of the blue, I started hearing whispers through mutual acquaintances. My parents were in financial trouble. Their house was falling behind on payments. My mother's job, which she had lied her way into, was under scrutiny. And, most painfully, they were talking about me. They were asking about my success, my income, my ability to help them. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let karma unfold naturally. But another part, angrier, sharper, realized this was the moment the tables had turned. The people who once mocked me, who told me I was a failure, were now dependent on me. And I finally held the leverage. I allowed myself a private smirk. The idea of them pleading, of groveling after years of cruelty and derision, gave me a strange satisfaction. I didn't plan to humiliate them unnecessarily, but the power shift was intoxicating. I had fought for every inch of my life, survived years of abuse, and now, for the first time, I could choose how they would exist in my world. Meanwhile, I kept building. Investments multiplied. I expanded my services, automated systems, and increased my team. My wealth wasn't just money. It was security, independence, and, most importantly, control. Control I never had as a child. Control I had earned the hard way. And still, my parents reached out, nervously at first, under the guise of reconciliation. But the intent was clear. They wanted help, advice, maybe even financial rescue. I felt the simmering tension of revenge and justice intertwining. Years of suffering and humiliation had led to this exact moment. It was finally my turn to choose the rules. The first real contact from my parents came via email. My mother's tone was unusually formal, almost fragile, and my father's messages, sporadic and awkward, were filled with vague requests for guidance, help with bills, and casual mentions of their hardships. They masked it with a veneer of humility, but the underlying desperation was unmistakable. I spent days reading and rereading their messages. Each one was a stark reminder of the years they had called me a failure, laughed at my homelessness, and undermined my sense of self. The sheer audacity to ask for help after everything was infuriating. But beneath the anger, I felt a strange calm. I had survived, grown, and thrived despite them. For the first time, I was the one with the power. Before replying, I mapped out every interaction. I created a mental ledger of every injustice, every insult, every mocking laugh. Each entry fueled my resolve, not for petty revenge, but for measured, deliberate action. I knew this wasn't just about money or status. It was about proving that years of cruelty wouldn't define me anymore. When I finally responded, I kept it cold, professional, and detached. I didn't offer solutions immediately. Instead, I asked pointed questions about their financial standing, their debts, and their future plans. Their answers revealed cracks I hadn't expected. They were worse off than I imagined: overdue bills, looming foreclosure, unpaid taxes. Their house was at risk, and without my intervention, they might have faced real disaster. That night, I reflected on the irony. The same parents who had watched me struggle on the streets were now vulnerable, exposed, and dependent. I could feel the scales of life tilting in a poetic justice only I could orchestrate. Years of survival, self-education, and determination had built a fortress of independence around me. I could see clearly that my parents were now outsiders, forced to navigate a world they had never truly mastered. I decided to meet them in person, not to humiliate, but to assert boundaries. The day of the meeting, I felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Their nervousness was palpable. The confident, mocking parents of my childhood were gone, replaced by anxious adults who had underestimated the consequences of their own actions. Sitting across from them, I saw the real fear in their eyes. They were forced to acknowledge the reality. I had built a life they could never fully control or understand. I remained calm, collected, and direct. I outlined their options clearly, demonstrating that while I had the ability to assist, I would do so on my terms. Every word was measured, every gesture intentional. For the first time, I felt vindication. Not from revenge, but from survival, resilience, and mastery over my own destiny. The child they laughed at, the homeless teen they ridiculed, had grown into someone they could no longer dismiss. And yet, I knew this was just the beginning. Their desperation was real, but my patience, planning, and principles would dictate the next moves. After the first confrontation, I realized that my parents were testing me, trying to gauge how far I would bend, how much I would forgive. They sent texts and emails every few days, alternating between pleading, flattery, and thinly veiled threats. Each one was a reminder of how their arrogance had blinded them for so long. But this time I held the power. I decided to set strict, non-negotiable terms before I considered helping them. They needed to understand that any support from me would not be unconditional or blind. I made a list of the rules: full disclosure of finances, debts, and assets; immediate cessation of any manipulative behavior, lies, or attempts to guilt me; proof of genuine effort to improve their lives without relying on me; a formal acknowledgement of the harm they caused, and a written apology, not for me, but for my siblings and for accountability; clear boundaries on communication: no late-night calls, No passive-aggressive messages, no blaming me for their misfortune. I sent these rules in a single cold email. I didn't sugarcoat my intentions. I made it clear, any violation, and my help disappears entirely. The response was telling. My mother's email was defensive and filled with excuses. My father's was hesitant, almost pleading. For the first time, I could see the cracks in their armor, the fear beneath their bravado. They were forced to confront the fact that the child they had mocked had grown into someone methodical, decisive, and unafraid. While waiting for their compliance, I also began assessing how much assistance they truly needed. Their house was in foreclosure, bills were mounting, and credit lines were maxed out. They had mismanaged nearly every aspect of their adult lives, and now they had nowhere to turn but me. I could see the irony. Those who once mocked my homelessness were now on the brink of it themselves. I didn't act impulsively. I took my time reviewing their finances, calculating exactly what support could stabilize them without giving them control over me. Every number, every line of debt, every overdue bill became a tool, a leverage point that reminded me of the years I had spent surviving without their help. When I finally offered assistance, it was not charity, it was strategic. I provided guidance, funds, and resources only as long as they adhered to the rules. My involvement came with accountability, a structured plan they had to follow, and weekly check-ins. I watched them adjust, stumble, and finally accept that their child, the one they had labeled a failure, was now the one holding the keys to their recovery. And through it all, I felt a sense of quiet triumph, not for making them suffer, but from the undeniable fact that I had survived, succeeded, and reclaimed my life on my own terms. For the first time, the power dynamics had reversed entirely. Even as I helped them navigate their crises, I was always conscious the child they destroyed could never be fully erased. Every request they made, every desperate plea, reminded me that I had risen above the years of ridicule, abuse, and neglect. Now they were forced to ask for help from the very person they had dismissed. Months passed with the rules firmly in place. My parents, who had once sneered at my failures and mocked my homelessness, were now relying on me for guidance and survival. Every phone call, every email, every request for assistance reminded them that the dynamic had completely shifted. The child they underestimated was now the adult in control. They began to follow the plan, slowly, clumsily, and sometimes reluctantly. Bills were paid on time, overdue accounts settled, and small steps toward personal responsibility were made. I monitored everything, ensuring no slip-ups, no manipulations, no attempts to revert to their old patterns. I refused to give them full access to my own life. Boundaries were clear. They were learning accountability the hard way, and I was the teacher they could not ignore. It was surreal to witness. The people who once called me a failure, who laughed when I was homeless, were now dependent on the structure I provided. My mother, in particular, had to swallow her pride and admit, without words even, that she had been wrong. My father, quiet and hesitant, gradually recognized the depth of my resilience. For the first time, they had to see me not as a child to be controlled, but as a competent, capable adult who had rebuilt a life from scratch. Throughout this process, I felt a mix of satisfaction and melancholy. Satisfaction, because I had achieved a kind of poetic justice. Those who tried to crush me were now the ones learning humility. Melancholy, because the past could never be erased. The years of abuse, the mockery, the endless struggles, they shaped me, but they also left scars that I carried daily. Still, I refused to let resentment consume me. This was about empowerment, not vengeance. As they stabilized, I began to distance myself slowly, letting them retain the lessons without letting them regain control over me. My wealth, my independence, and my ability to make decisions for my own life were untouchable. I could provide support without sacrificing autonomy. This balance allowed me to reflect on how far I had come, from a homeless teenager labeled a failure to a self-sufficient adult who now held the upper hand. In the end, my parents begged for help. Yes, but it was no longer charity or submission. It was recognition. recognition of the strength, resilience, and intelligence that they had overlooked for decades. I realized that their dependence on me was not just financial, it was symbolic. It represented a reckoning with their own past mistakes and a tacit acknowledgement of my triumph over them. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The satisfaction came quietly in the knowledge that I had survived, succeeded, and reclaimed my life. The years of humiliation, abuse, and struggle had forged me into someone unbreakable. And now, when they asked for help, they weren't just seeking assistance. They were forced to respect the person I had become. The failure they laughed at was gone. In its place was someone unstoppable. Looking back, I understand something important. Survival alone is impressive, but thriving on your own terms is transformative. I had turned a life built on adversity into a platform of strength, and in the process, I had rewritten the story, my story. My parents' regret was merely a byproduct of the life I chose, a testament to the resilience that they once tried to destroy. And that was more than enough.